Welcome to the Professional Technical Interviewee. I'm Taylor Dorsett. In my 6-year career in technical recruiting, I realized that just about every company does technical interviews differently. Many very good senior engineers do not do well in technical interviews, despite being great developers. The only way to get better at interviewing is to practice. Many early career engineers don't really know what a technical interview is like until they're in their first one. Our goal here is to change that and shed some light on the technical interview.
My guest today is Paul Czajka. He's a staff engineer at Classkick and a Braintree alum. And he now splits his time between Michigan and Palm Springs after living a van life for the last few years. In the second half, we do a live system design interview, the first that I've ever done. So I hope you enjoy.
Hello, Paul. Thank you so much for being on the show. We've known each other, for probably 5-6 years at this point?
Yeah, about that. Maybe even a little bit longer.
Yeah. Back in the day when I used to do a lot of recruiting in the Microsoft space, I think is when we actually met. And your background is kind of an interesting one, and I think unique to a lot of engineers, maybe something a lot of engineers in the Microsoft stack have interest in doing. But to give you the full intro, and then I'll let you kind of share a little bit about your background. Paul Czajka is the guest today. He is a staff engineer currently at Classkick. Before that was at Braintree, and I think a number of other companies here in Chicagoland. And if I remember correctly, you're in the enviable position of splitting your time between like Michigan and maybe Chicagoland and then Palm Springs, which is why we get those beautiful palm trees in the background.
Yes, avoid cold at all costs.
I think becoming very popular in the COVID remote era.
It is indeed. Yes.
Great. Well, if you can share a little bit more details just about your background and then kind of what you're doing now and kind of what your team works on at Classkick, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, it's kind of an interesting background. I started my original entry into the software engineering market was in the Microsoft stack. I spent a good amount of time in it, and about 10 of my first years was all at one company, which was a SaaS 3-suite application product in the learning analytics space, Microsoft stack. And I worked my way from engineer up through software architect, got super expert great at C# and the Microsoft stack. Made some early mistakes. I was put in, I think, too much of a position of power and authority, and I rolled out some really big architectural changes that were bad because I was young in my career. So I spent the next 8 years fixing those and learning from them, really increasing my chops in the software architecture, code architecture space, like maintainable, sustainable code practices. And yet, after all of that, I found a huge gap in system level understanding. Microsoft does great with helping developers reduce clicks, but kind of, at least at the time, at the expense of exposing engineers to the internals of machines they were working on and isolating them. I'm not sure if that's the case anymore. It's been a while since I've been in the stack. But reached a point where I was like, okay, I'm really good with the software, but I don't know anything about the system. I'm going to jump out of Microsoft stack and jump into open source, which was scary because I was senior level at Microsoft Technologies, but I was junior level outside of that. And that was really hard. So luckily, I found a company, Braintree, that was looking for people that were good engineers that were not super great in their particular alphabet soup necessarily. They just wanted people that could engineer. So they hired me on, and I basically learned the stack, open source stack, from the performance and scalability perspective. So this was back when Braintree was going through its a pretty big growth stage, and there were some pretty big technical concerns about some walls in the future that we were going to hit. So we were working on scaling the databases, scaling the code, the application, helping to scale the applications to support the growth. So that's where I dove into more understanding of like Postgres, scaling servers, VM settings configuration for maximal throughput. Web server tuning, all this fun stuff, way deeper in the system. So with all of that background, I sort of hit okay, I'm tired now. I need a break. I'm a little worn out. And then I took a nice break for about a year doing the van life.
I love it.
Yeah, and then COVID hit, and it had me stranded in Palm Springs, where I am now.
Not the worst place to be stranded
Not
in,
the
right?
worst place. Not the worst place. So van life came to an abrupt early end, and with no place really to live except out of a hotel for a month. It's like, okay, I should probably look for some work. So spun up a quick consulting corporation and just put some feelers out there. And my partner, who I met in my van life travels and actually ended up in Palm Springs also, connected me through a series of connections, and that brought me to Classkick, who was scaling. They needed some serious scaling because COVID hit. Students are in need of remote learning. Classkick is a remote learning platform, and their usage just went through the roof. And they went from a scrap little startup to needing to scale to web scale like yesterday. So with my experience at Braintree, helping with scaling, I was brought on to do some analysis and help them understand what their root causes were and help to formulate some plans on how to address them and start to help to work them through them. That was almost a year ago, exactly. I think I started working for them March 15th last year. And I was on and off contracts with them through the year. And then I ended up loving it so much that I jumped on full time, which I did in December, I believe, as a staff eng. Yeah. So currently, staff eng focused on platform scalability. Also do a little bit of diving into full stack, limited, but a bit as needed. So I'm kind of like a touch. I'll touch anything that I have to touch, but I focus mainly on system architecture and scalability with the very growing team that we have, and helping to grow the team as well through interviews and such. So that's what we're today.
That's awesome. It seems interesting to me that you started your career early on, kind of as you had to learn kind of how to help something scale as the company scaled, right? And then that became almost this theme throughout your career, right? And that's something that through my years in recruiting, I realized how many companies don't know how to do that effectively, either on the business side or on the technology side, right? Sometimes it's, oh no, we've got 5 successful products all of a sudden when we're used to only having 1 or 2, and now we don't have the technical capabilities anymore. But it seems like people now are thinking more about that ahead of time, and obviously if they know people like yourself who can come on board and help with that, that probably saves them a lot of headaches down the road, right?
It does, yeah. If you're aware of that early enough and make some strides early, which is hard, it's a hard sell because management tends to look at concrete information for guidance. And if you don't have, it's hard to put concrete information down to say, yeah, if we don't do this thing, we're not going to be able to meet this future target that we think we might have. Usually in my experience, what happens is you hit a scaling problem and then it opens your eyes and you start to look for other scaling problems and then take more broad action on them, which is kind of the place that we've been in with Classkick. Is we hit a scaling problem. Now we're aware of it. Now we're looking at that as well as all kinds of scaling problems, like not only how do you scale the technology, but how do you scale engineering practices on the team to support new growth? How do you scale customer success team to support changing landscape of user growth? Like the field is wide open now on scaling, and our eyes are open. So it does take sometimes a bit of a critical emergency to get you there.
Yeah. What's the tech stack look like on kind of your team specifically, but also company wide?
Yeah. So the application stack is an Angular front end, an Angular and iOS front end, and Scala Spring Boot back end. We're on MySQL. We use Firebase. And that's the major components. And as we are now, we're sort of looking at tuning them all and identifying, well, which ones will help us get in the future and which ones we need to tweak and change to get us to the future that we want.
And I want to touch on your shift from the Microsoft stack into more open source, the open source world, right? Because I think that's something that there may be people that are either in the Microsoft stack just from that's where they started their career, right? Or they've been in it for a long time, like yourself, and feel very strong in that area, but I don't know if limited is the right word, but certainly does feel like there's less options sometimes, right? And very likely in the startup space or maybe the kind of rapidly growing company space. So I guess I know your transition, Braintree, and there's a few other companies, at least in Chicago, that I know of that say, hey, as long as this person can pass our kind of technical bar, we know they can figure this stuff out and we'll give them the time they need to ramp up. But do you have any advice or can you share a little bit about kind of what your thought process was around making that transition?
Yeah, I did some digging around, trying to read some information, case stories, ask around to you and other recruiters, say, hey, have you seen this done before? And the common answer was not too often. It kind of felt like, at least once you've been so long in Microsoft, you're kind of pigeonholed. Yeah, there was a lot of concern. So I think the approach that I took was really look for companies that just wanted solid engineers that have an appetite for learning and growth.
Yeah.
And we're comfortable with the risk of hiring someone who didn't have the specific skill set.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a 50-50. Interviewing is really, there's two sides of the coin. One is the interviewee side, one is the interviewer side. As an interviewee, your power is limited to what you can bring to the table. And then it's in the interviewer's side to make sure you find a company that is looking for the things that you can offer. And that's really the other half of all of this, is not only finding those companies, but finding those companies that are interviewing well for the skills that they actually need.
Yeah, and when you say that, it also brings to mind if you have skills outside of just what can I do within that language, that might make that transition easier as well. Because it seems like you obviously had experience kind of scaling with the company, kind of a startup environment, having like leadership experience within that environment, but then also just understanding scalable systems, right, from your mistakes over the years. So I think just coming with that, yes, they go the technical knowledge from a Ruby syntax standpoint, is it here yet? No, but do they have this other thing that they can bring to the table that may even be more important or more difficult to find than a strong engineer with whatever that language is? So I think that certainly helps if you can bring more to the table than just one specific language experience.
It really does. It's really about how transferable is your skill set beyond a single language and framework. And that really gets to your grasp and your chops in engineering discipline, engineering best practices, and the things that generally make engineers more valuable, which is not only writing code that automates human actions, basically, and creates leverage in that respect, but also doing so in a way that is maintainable and extendable. Like if you write something and it takes you a long time to write it, once you're done, the idea is that you should never have to touch it again, which never happens. We all know that. Or when you do have to touch it again, it's cheap and easy to do so, meaning it doesn't take a long time to ramp up and learn what was done. It doesn't introduce new bugs and defects to change it. And there's confidence in understanding that your changes will be successful. So all of that speaks to your grasp of transferable engineering discipline and practices, which is software engineering patterns, understanding of scalability concerns, performance concerns in what you build. And you'll notice nothing that I said in this answer has been about a specific language. If you can demonstrate as an interviewee that you grasp these concepts, then you can apply them to any language and any framework. You just have to learn the specific syntax and the specific characteristics of the framework. And if your interviewer understands that, then then you're good. It's hard to find that sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, I'm curious, as far as from a technical interviewing perspective, have you done, I know you've been with Classkick, it seems like for a little over a year now, but have you done technical interviews lately, I guess, as an actual interviewer or for your team, like when you're interviewing?
So the last interview I went through personally was the one for Classkick,
Hmm.
which was interesting. We can talk about that more later if you're curious.
Sure.
Since then, we've grown as a company. We've added on some new people, notably our head of engineering, which has done a fantastic job of revamping the interview process. Now, the process as well as its components, including the interview and how it functions, and
Hmm.
what we're interviewing for in this structure, and all that fun, gory detail. So, over the past year, I've been one of the members of the interviewing group, which has largely been most of the company because the company is so small. So yeah, I've been taking part in interviewing engineer candidates, even some product managers as well, um, and we've used a pretty honed process, but we are continuing to hone it. So it's a really interesting, fun journey, but we've come a long way with it.
Yeah. What are you typically evaluating for, when you're interviewing for your team?
Uh, Everything. That's the short answer. So we really do kind of two technical interviews. One is, well, we break technical interviews up into pieces. I think as
Hmm.
anybody who's gone through technical interviews knows, they are particularly grueling. They oftentimes last an entire day, and you're put through multiple sessions. It's not out of the norm. So we kind of follow suit to some extent. We try not to be a full day nor completely grueling, but we will evaluate the ability to complete a technical task on their own, which is the take home, which
Hmm.
basically lets them showcase um, at their own time, within a time box window at their own speed, what their technical chops are, so we can see sort of where they're at. Then we will walk them through a system design, which is very broad, very sometimes large and nebulous question, which I'll be walking you through one of these in the interview portion of our segment. That is intended to sort of touch on breadth. So we want to understand, like, are you aware of, no matter what your role is, if you're front end engineer, back end engineer, data engineer, you name it. It's like, what are you aware of? And we do this because people move around a lot. We want to understand, okay, what's the full range of capabilities? Like, are you aware of front end, back end, scaling, database? Like, what's your awareness? How deep is it? So that's our system design. And then we have uh, a pairing session where we gauge their ability to work with somebody on
Hmm.
the problem of their own design, which was their take-home solution. And that's really to sort of just see their work in action, how they interact. So each of these is very different, and each of them has a very well defined rubric, which I think is super critical as an interviewer. Is you need to have
So
clear
important.
rubrics, yes, and each rubric is sliced and diced according to the different capabilities we're looking for, with levels according to like uh, meets exceeds needs basically. So we kind of have a skeleton framework for all of these, and then we apply them basically to all engineering interviews,
Yeah.
with slight tweaks for each different kind of role to let them showcase and test their very specific skill set.
That's great. I mean, I think it's got to be very satisfying to go through an interview process that maybe wasn't ideal and then being able to come on board and help make that process better, right? Because I think that's something that often gets pushed to the wayside, right? Is was that a good experience for the people going through it? And even if it wasn't a good experience for the people, once you're on board, you often forget about it, right? You're like, oh, we're on to the next thing. We just got to build whatever we're trying to build. So that, I mean, that sounds like a very structured and very mindful, which is again, I think it's just interviewing becomes an easy thing to go, I'll just look up some things online on how to interview for data engineers. And then those are the questions I'm going to ask. Right.
Yeah, and that's really gets to the heart of what I think Classkick has done beautifully in this respect is um, when we were designing uh, the interview process, it was a company-wide effort, and it was saturated in empathy and support. So we
Yeah.
want to be empathic for not only for of course our interviewees, but also our interviewers, and we want to support them both. It's no use sort of creating a grilling, horrible, exhausting, stressful interview session because you're not going to get the clearest signal of interviewers' potential unless that's what daily life is like at your company. Then, yeah, you want your interviews to look like that. But in any case, you want your interviews to sort of look and feel like your actual work environment. And we're a pretty empathic, um, emotionally intelligent company, I feel, and
Mhm.
we've tried to integrate that into the interview process. And I think that helps us get the best signal for people that will fit well in our particular work.
Yeah. I mean, that's incredible. I've seen that become a trend more and more recently where people tend to, or I think companies are just trying to make the effort to recognize like, um, we want this to be a good process and to have some idea around the emotional quality and just the emotional impact of interviewing, right? Where, as someone who not too long ago went through a boot camp and then realized just the amount of no's you hear in a job search early on. And even to a certain extent, when you get more senior, you still get a lot more no's than you do yeses, right? So it's just a draining process. And if you have a company that even if they care a little bit more and do it a little bit more nicely, then you can tell there's some thought put into it. That helps a lot, right? Versus just leaving a bad taste in someone's mouth because they got ghosted or it was a terrible process, and then they got one line email saying you're out, right?
Or no email at all, and just you're left to
Yeah.
dry.
Yeah. It's interesting when you were talking about scalability, and I think you touched on this a little bit earlier. There is almost, it comes to a certain point where you have to design your interview process and almost your internal kind of structure of how your engineers are leveled correctly with scalability in mind if you're going to grow to a certain scale, right? And a notable example in Chicago was Trunk Club a number of years ago. They kind of hit a point where they went, oh, our business has scaled significantly, and like that side of the business is fantastic, but the technical side, like we still, a lot of it's kind of the Wild West here, right? And they brought someone on board from Groupon who specifically had helped build out those levels and kind of build out what their rubric looks like when they're hiring at Groupon, and brought them to do that same thing at Trunk Club. And that was really great when I was recruiting for them to be able to tell that story of like they've put a lot of thought into this, and it's because they want to hire 100 engineers in the next 3 years. Like they know they can't just keep doing it willy-nilly because there's only so many people to interview, right? Before
Yes.
you've if you've burned too many, you can't bring people on board anymore, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We've engaged some support in that respect. We're working with a third party that is helping us to source and slim down the candidate pool. One of our core values is diversity and inclusion, and we found a third party that can help us really find a pool that is focused on diversity and inclusion as one of its core criteria. So that takes a lot of
Yeah.
weight off of our process, at least from the engineering manager perspective. But yeah, once you start to actually interview these people, then it can be a pretty big drain on the team and productivity and focus. So yeah, those are all uh, significant concerns to sort of keep aware of and plan for as you grow.
Yeah, and you said you have a standardized system that the interviews kind of look like, but then you tweak them according to kind of the role specifically.
Yep. So the whole thing is it's an evolving process. So
Yeah.
we have now we do retrospectives and we evolve the process as we go. But where it is now is we have a consistent framework. We have a consistent rubric. The details are different in terms of, for example, the take home for a front end engineer is different than a back end engineer than you know a data engineer. So we
Mhm.
do sort of cut things to specifics for the roles. But then like I said, the system design aspect is pretty broad, and we do sort of test widely. So yeah, the process sort of stays the same, but the details of what we put into the process change a bit per role.
Yeah, you mentioned pairing in the interview as well. Is that something that's a big part of the kind of the work environment and work style at Classkick?
Not really. I mean, we will liberally pair when there's a need to, but we do not require it. We don't like say, oh, you should be pairing. It's basically left up to individuals. We find a lot of value, especially for onboarding. We have kind of an onboarding buddy system where there is a heavy pairing to make sure that new hires ramp up quickly and confidently. But beyond that, it's really left up to individuals to reach out and say, hey, I'd like to pair on this. And it's common enough that we definitely want signal on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so helpful too when you're actually evaluating how you can, not just for technical skills, but how you're going to be able to work with that individual, right? Even if it's just one data point, right? Just the communication style can be, you just get a lot more insight into it, right? And for an interviewer, sometimes it's stressful to pair, but also I do think there's a little bit more communication, and likewise, you can kind of interview the company to a certain extent.
Yes, I'm glad you said that. That is so the other part of interviewing that most interviewees don't consider enough, in my opinion, is you really should be interviewing your interviewer as much as
Yeah.
they're interviewing you. You want to make sure that you are comfortable with them. It's a two-way street. So yes.
Yeah, it's a common theme to the guests we've had on the show is just how important that is to make sure that you're actually going to go work at a place where you're excited about joining that team, right? Obviously, if you have to pay the bills, you have to pay the bills, and sometimes that's a situation people are in, especially early career. But at a certain point, the script really does flip to a certain extent. And in my recruiting career, when I was focusing mostly with senior and engineering leader level folks, a lot of it is this culturally a good fit for me? Do I enjoy working with these people? Because I'm going to put in 50, 60, 80 hour weeks where I want to make sure I'm not going to hate this person most of that time, right?
Oh my God, 50, 60, 80 hour weeks. Ouch. But yes, yeah, you definitely want to understand that. And sometimes it's not earlier in your career, you don't really know where you fit yet. I think I'm a pretty late bloomer in that respect. Like I jumped into a couple things that in retrospect, I'm like, what was I thinking? I was obviously not appropriate for that environment. And my level of burnout was a really clear indicator. And I learned, so sometimes it's just a learning, a process of learning where you fit and where you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you feel that you actually do in technical interviews?
Mixed bag. I do very well in the communication aspect, generally speaking. Like I think I have a pretty clear ability to communicate what I'm thinking, my thought process, where I'm going with something. So I like to just communicate that out during the interview, whether it's hashing through an algorithm or system design or pairing. I'm very good at sort of speaking and clearly bringing people along with me. So that's easy. But when it comes to the actual technical chops, it's a very mixed bag. I think I don't do well if I'm being expected to write code that will run beautifully and be syntactically correct.
Sure.
With someone looking over my shoulder, it's just very uncomfortable. That's not how I work. But if it's like a pseudocode kind of thing, and you want to, or like generally creating an algorithm that's somewhat performant or more performant, or understanding the system of how system pieces work together, scalability concerns, software patterns and practices, those I do better on. But yeah, it can be a pretty mixed bag. And I think a lot of it has to do with my stress levels in the moment. Once my stress levels get high in any particular session, my performance is going to tank.
Sure.
There's a whole lot of factors involved there.
Yeah. I think I've mentioned this before, but when I was doing my first set of technical interviews right out of a boot camp, I think I've just gone through a lot of high stress situations in the past, and I felt like I would be fine. But then I realized when it was just me and a technical problem I knew I had no idea how to answer, that was like a whole new level of like, oh great, this is just peak stress immediately, and I'm just sweating, right? And I had to very mindfully try to find ways to force myself just to breathe, right? And then to kind of calm down and go, okay, well, let's read one part and see if we can get one piece of information from this, right? So at least we're moving forward. And I think many people, I don't think there's a lot of people that actually get that much better at that skill set. Maybe they just get better at kind of understanding problems. But I think that core kind of fear thing stays for a lot of people even throughout their career.
It it certainly can. I think you can develop skills that will mitigate their negative impact in the interview.
Yeah.
And I have a great example of this, which was actually when I was interviewing for Classkick. In their algorithm portion of the interview at the time, where they threw a very specific technical problem, basically like a dictionary sort, complicated dictionary sort problem, at me and said, "Go at it." I started to work through it. Had some trouble understanding the problem and really sort of getting my a solid ground under me. And then once I did, I took a path that ended up being entirely fruitless and wrong. And then this was by the time I got there, it was like 45 minutes in, and it was, I think, an hour session. I was like, okay, up to this point, I had communicated very well about everything, about what I was doing, where I was going, even though it was down an ultimately incorrect path. The communication was good. I didn't lose my cool, even though internally I was very stressed and increasingly stressed. By this time, the 45 minutes hit, I was like, internally, I'm like, I'm done. Brain shut off. I'm over this. This is ridiculous. I'm so done. But what came out of my mouth was, okay, I feel like we've sort of exhausted options in available space. I feel like by this time you have the signal you were probably looking for in this interview session. So I'm comfortable calling it and closing it here, even though we don't have a successful interview. How do you guys feel about that? Just closing out with that clear communication is like,
Mm-hmm.
it was fine. And feedback I got was I actually passed the session, even though I failed the technical problem itself. So I think the skills you can develop are just keeping cool and calm and collected and communicative under pressure, even if
Yeah.
the stress and tension never goes away.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like there's a certain amount of awareness too that obviously one piece of that technical right is solve the problem, right? But then all the other pieces are communication, thought process. Are you able to walk them along with your solution? And you were able to recognize, great, I've done that piece, right? Even if we don't have the problem successfully giving the output that they want, you knew that piece was in place, which allows you to be in a position, even if you feel very frustrated, to say, I think we've done what we're trying to do here, right?
Right. Yeah, because the problem was really, really hard. I don't know if anyone solved it, like ever in the history of that problem at Classkick interviewing. So you shouldn't let the fact that you can't solve the problem derail you, because that really isn't what you should be evaluated on.
Mm-hmm.
You should be evaluated on everything about, not only that, I should say, but everything around the process of how you solve it, how you interact, and the whole picture of you through the process.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, do you have a system when you're presented with a very difficult problem or problem that you don't immediately go, oh, I can use this solution, right? Do you have a system to break that down to help you approach it?
Um, yes, I think the first thing is just to have a really good, strong sync, communicate your understanding of the problem and have that validated back to you. That's
Mm-hmm.
super important. And then from there, I'll sometimes just do my own version of shelling out a solution using pseudocode in whatever form and function makes sense to me. Sometimes I'll just write a series of comment lines like, do this, do this, do this, and then I'll start to add some pseudocode around the comments, and then I'll start to beef it up. And I only go so far each time to sort of explore the possibility. I like to do a probe attack, basically. Like, I'll give it some thought. I come up with an idea that I think works, and then I will go as far as I can quickly and to see if it's viable. And if it doesn't, I back it out, throw it away, and go a different direction.
Mhm.
That can look a little jarring to people if you are not very communicative. Imagine watching someone solve this problem and they don't talk about what they're doing when they're doing the probe attack. You're like, what is this person doing? Out, done, not a fit. But if you
Yeah.
communicate very clearly what you're doing, then it brings them along and it makes more sense. So I think the two things are communication around your own particular style. You just have to understand what your style is and how to communicate it.
Yeah, and when you say probe attack, do you mean like you're kind of mentally talking through different algorithms that you would specifically use, or algorithm plus kind of I might use nested loops for this, or I might use X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, exactly. I'll give it some thought. Usually, let intuition sort of play its part and come up with an idea. Like maybe recursion is the right thing. So let's go down the recursion route for this problem. Start to pseudocode it out, and if it doesn't look like it's optimal, I'm like, oh wait, actually, you know what? Recursion isn't really what we're looking for here. We actually want this other algorithm. Then I'll try that out. And in the course of that, if that doesn't work, then I might pause at that point. And I might ask some more questions, because two fails is like, okay, maybe I'm moving too fast here. So let's step back and give this some more thought, and then go at it from a new angle, after taking a brief break. And I think that's important, though, is giving yourself the freedom to create little breaks and mental space for yourself in the midst of a stressful process, and taking opportunity for those when you can.
Yeah, and I do think that helps too with that fear that deer in the headlights thing that can happen early in an interview, especially if you don't know how to solve the problem. If you go, okay, let my mind kind of run with a couple ideas, and if as long as I'm communicating through it, you're being effective, right? That's what you're being evaluated on, is can I look at different approaches? And even if your first one's not the right one, that's fine, because oftentimes, right, in engineering, the first approach is not going to be the one that ends up being the long-term solution, right?
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Do you have tips or kind of advice for people who are in technical interviews? I mean, it sounds like these breaks and kind of being able to look at things and kind of breathe throughout it is important. But anything else that you would highlight or advise people to do?
Absolutely. Some other factors that we're looking for, and that I found success in looking for over the many years I've been involved in interviewing people, is finding core engineering competencies and a certain level of self-actualization that is appropriate for their career position, I guess. So with that, what I mean by all that is we basically look for people that understand what level they're at, correctly self-identify what level they're at, are comfortable with that level. Then all the other things that we mentioned, communicate well, have the chops that they say they do, and can demonstrate those. So I think if you bring, as an interviewee, a sense of confidence in where you are that is correct, and can demonstrate that, and can communicate well through the process, I think that is the majority of the battle there.
Yeah.
What we find difficulty with is people that think they're senior level, apply for senior level position, self-identify as senior level, and then they come in and they don't have senior level skills.
Sure.
So, or they're uncomfortable with the fact that they don't have a particular skill. I think being comfortable in this, I think I said this already, being comfortable with where you're at, that's super important. One of the signals we look for is when you are met with unfamiliar information, what do? Are you defensive? Do you hand wave answers? Do you avoid it? Or are you, that's interesting, tell me more about that? One of those answers makes for a much better engineer than the others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a consistent trend in some of the most successful, might be the right word, but probably well regarded and easy to work with engineers that I know is the Oh, interesting. Okay, let's explore that, right? Or just at
Yeah,
least being open to that.
yeah,
And often it's, I mean, stuff's changing so quickly. I think people realize like, oh, you can't know everything, right? This early career bootcamp graduate might come in with some new ES6 feature that the senior developer doesn't know about, and you go, oh, that makes sense, right? And then that person is able to kind of get a win out of sharing that information, which can be a very different situation from someone just like you said, hand waving and go, well, that's not how we do it here, right? Or that I don't like that way, right? Without having it's almost subtle, right? But it does feel very different for the individual.
it does. Yeah, it's really key, I think.
Do you have advice on people on kind of how to show that in an interview without, especially early career, without coming in and saying, I'm junior, but I'll take a crack at it, right? Or someone who's maybe a couple years in who knows, I'm not quite senior yet, but I've got some skills, right? And they don't necessarily know how to kind of slot themselves.
So we run everybody through everybody who passes our initial screening. That means that we feel like they've identified enough skills to be in line with what they've presented, that it's probably worth to bring them in. We aren't looking. So there's two ways to look at this from an interviewer perspective in the way that we work. One is you can have a rubric that everybody has to meet the specific rubric levels that are defined for this role.
Yeah.
Or you can be more organic and you can say, okay, we have this rubric. We're just going to see where the individual falls at all the levels on the rubric. And then we're going to look at those capabilities and see how that maps to what we have and what we need on the team.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they're not senior level at this thing, that's fine because we got someone who is, but they have these skills that we don't. Like it can be organic that way. So what we do is we run people through the process and we get their assessment levels on the various facets of the rubric, and then we evaluate sort of where do they fit and what makes sense. And I think the system design portion of our interview really helps to get to the answer of your question is how do we let these engineers sort of showcase their skills that may be better than their actual level, or maybe just prove that they're or illuminate that they have gaps. And the system design is where we can ask the engineers a broad spectrum of things, and we can touch on enough pieces to understand where those different strengths and gaps are. And the strengths and the gaps will come out naturally. And we have seen very clear cases where junior engineers are like solidly mid-level in certain system aspects. And we're like, oh, that's great. Or senior engineers are solidly mid-level or junior on certain aspects, and that's fine. So part of it is designing the process to allow that information to come out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking recently, even on my own team, internally at my job now, probably the biggest difference between, our lead slash manager and the senior developers would be like, our lead is the one who's really designing a lot of what we're actually doing, right? Senior developers might be just as capable with Ruby, give or take a little bit, right? But as far as actually being able to design something, I think that's very much the lead's probably greatest strength in that aspect, right? And that's very clear to I think everyone who's in those conversations, which I was realizing recently. If that doesn't come out in an interview, how would someone kind of tech out? But it does make sense to evaluate on those things, especially if that's going to be used internally, right? Or those skill sets are going to be valued.
Yep, exactly. So I'm going to run you through this process where we basically throw a very large design problem at you. And we would throw a similar kind of problem at any level. And we would take a different approach with different levels. Like a lead engineer, we would just sit back and let them lead. A junior engineer, we would give them the floor, and if they can run with it, great. But if they need help, we are there to support them and usher them towards a segment of the question that they're more comfortable with and can execute on. And then the outcome of both of those is we know exactly what their leadership capabilities are in a generic design problem.
Yeah, well, I'm excited. I will be honest. I believe this would be my first true design interview. So,
Wow.
it's exciting. Before we move on, any different advice for early career engineers? I mean, it seems like these are all valuable things to keep in mind. Anything additional or different that you would give to people who maybe it's their first job or first few jobs?
Well, you really got to rest on your non-technical skills at that point, which means just developing a solid foundation of good communication, curiosity, interest and drive, and excitement to learn, and then continuing to learn and taking every opportunity to grow your skill set. And then every new job you go on, bring to bear your previous skills you've learned and be hungry for more. And that'll get you very, very far.
Great. Well, before we move into the technical portion, I mean, any interview horror stories that you'd like to share in the past, and maybe folks who are in the interview process can relate to and see that it's not all roses?
Yeah, there's kind of two. One was actually a really negative, horrible experience. We'll start there. It was in between my time at the Microsoft Technology SaaS business and Braintree. I took like 2 years in the wilderness where I was jumping into the financial industry. I think that was in 2008, right at the financial collapse. It was a hot mess. Mm-hmm. I got enamored by, the run up in that sort of led to the financial collapse of like engineer salaries who were working at hedge funds, like, ooh, money, money, money. So I went looking around for jobs at hedge funds and proprietary trading firms. And one proprietary trading firm in particular was an awful experience. I came in with a C# expertise, and they were looking for a C++ or a C# expert. So I applied, and they accepted the application for interview, and I was scheduled for an interview. So I get there, and it turns out that the hiring manager I was working with was fired between accepting and arriving, and it was replaced with someone else, and they had changed the position to be C++ instead of also C#. So I arrive, and I'm greeted by this very unpleasant human who almost immediately started to belittle me and like, what do you know about C++? And I was like, well, I don't know anything. I accepted this based on C#. And instead of being like a mature human and saying, oh, apologies, don't want to waste your time, we're actually looking for C++. He kept me on the hook and ran me through the interview, which I actually did pretty well on with the generic algorithm programming. But when it came to C++, obviously there was no information there. And he was just grueling. He kept putting me through sessions. And he even came at one time and threw a big C++ reference book on the desk at me and said, here, read this for 15 minutes, and walked out. I wasn't self-aware enough at that point to get up and leave myself, so I just sat through it. But I got a small amount of satisfaction in the fact that by the end of the interview process, I was so stressed out and had completely worn through my deodorant that the room stunk to high heaven. So when he came into the room, he would actually like wince, and I got some small satisfaction out of that. Kept him in that room as long as I could. And then at the end of the interview, when it was all over, and he walked me out into the interview, into the elevator. As the elevator door is closing, he's like, well, I'm sorry, I can't lead you on anymore. You don't have the job. Bye. I'm like, wow.
Wow.
So that, folks, is what you do not do as an interviewer.
That might take the cake as the worst / best story on the show so far. I mean, maybe the advice is wear light deodorant if you're unsure about the interview, right?
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app at The Professional Technical Interviewee. I want to thank my guest and my wonderful editor and producer, Dustin Bays. If you're interested in sharing your technical interview advice and being on the show, please reach out at dorsetttaylordev@gmail.com. As a reminder, this interview has 2 parts. You can find the second half, which is the live technical interview, on YouTube at The Professional Technical Interviewee. The link will be in the show notes. Until next time, keep practicing.